Ancient Egyptian civilization, gifts of the Nile and sands of time. To understand the civilization of ancient Egypt, one must first understand the river. Without the Nile, the history of this region would be nothing more than a footnote in the geological record of the Sahara Desert. The Greek historian Herodotus famously called Egypt the gift of the Nile. And this was not merely a poetic observation, but a fundamental geographical truth. For thousands of years, the pulse of Egyptian life was dictated by the annual inundation, a predictable flood fueled by the monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands that surged northward, causing the river to swell and overflow its banks. When the waters receded, they left behind a thick layer of nutrient-rich black silt, known to the ancient Egyptians as Kemet, the Black Land. This fertile strip, rarely extending more than a few miles on either side of the riverbank, stood in stark contrast to Deshret, the Red Land, the inhospitable expanse of desert that flanked the valley. This duality between the fertile order of the valley and the chaotic sterility of the desert shaped the Egyptian worldview, embedding a deep psychological desire for balance, known as Ma'at, which would become the central pillar of their religion, politics, and social structure. The human story of Egypt begins long before the pharaohs. In the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, climate change forced nomadic hunter-gatherers toward the reliable water source of the Nile as the North African savannas dried up. By 5000 before the Common Era, distinct cultures such as the Badarian and later the Naqada cultures began to emerge. These pre-dynastic societies laid the groundwork for what was to come, developing pottery, stone tools, and the early seeds of religious iconography. Archaeological excavations at Hierakonpolis and Abydos have revealed that the concept of kingship was evolving centuries before the First Dynasty. We see the emergence of local chieftains and proto-kings who utilized warfare and ritual to consolidate power. The most famous artifact from this transitional period is the Narmer palette, a siltstone slab often interpreted as depicting the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. On one side, King Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, and on the other, the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing the fusion of the two lands under a single divine ruler. This unification, occurring around 3100 before the Common Era, marks the beginning of the early dynastic period and the dawn of pharaonic civilization. During the early dynastic period, comprising the first and second dynasties, the fundamental institutions of the Egyptian state were established. The capital was founded at Memphis, strategically located at the apex of the Nile Delta, allowing the king to control both the valley to the south and the delta to the north. It was during this time that the concept of the pharaoh as a god-king took root. The king was not merely a political leader, but the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god. His primary duty was the maintenance of Ma'at, representing truth, justice, harmony, and cosmic order. If the king ruled well and performed the necessary rituals, the sun would rise, the Nile would flood, and Egypt would prosper. If he failed, chaos, or Isfet, would swallow the land. This theological framework provided the justification for the immense centralization of resources that would characterize the upcoming Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom, spanning the 3rd to the 6th dynasties, is often referred to as the Age of Pyramids. It represents a period of unprecedented stability, economic prosperity, and architectural innovation. The evolution of the royal tomb during this era offers a fascinating window into the developing engineering prowess of the Egyptians. Initially, kings were buried in mastabas, flat-roofed rectangular structures made of mud brick. However, in the 3rd dynasty, the architect Imhotep, serving King Djoser, revolutionized architecture by stacking mastabas of decreasing size on top of one another using stone blocks. The result was the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first monumental stone structure in history. Imhotep's innovation was not just structural but theological, creating a stairway to the heavens for the deceased monarch. This experimentation continued into the 4th dynasty under King Sneferu, who built 3 massive pyramids. His attempts at Medum and the Bent Pyramid at Dashur faced structural failures and design changes, but his 3rd attempt, the Red Pyramid, achieved the perfect geometrical shape. Sneferu moved more stone than any other pharaoh in history, perfecting the techniques that his son Khufu would use to build the Great Pyramid at Giza. The Great Pyramid is a testament to the organizational capacity of the Egyptian state. Contrary to popular myth, it was not built by slaves but by a conscripted labor force of peasants known as corvée labor. These workers provided their labor as a form of tax during the flood season, when farming was impossible. They were organized into teams, housed in barracks, and fed high-protein diets, as evidenced by the worker villages excavated at the Giza Plateau. The construction of the Giza complex, which includes the pyramids of Khafre and Menkaure and the Great Sphinx, required a sophisticated bureaucracy to manage logistics, supply chains, and the redistribution of resources, proving that the Old Kingdom was a highly stratified and efficient state. However, the immense cost of these building projects, combined with the rising power of provincial governors known as nomarchs, began to erode the central authority of the pharaoh. The 6th dynasty saw the incredibly long reign of Pepi II, during which the ossification of the administration became apparent. Upon his death, a crisis of leadership coincided with a severe climatic event. Around 2200, before the Common Era, a shift in global climate patterns caused a series of low Nile floods, leading to famine and economic collapse. This ushered in the First Intermediate Period, a time of chaos and civil war that lasted for over a century. Inscriptions from this era describe a world turned upside down, where brothers fought brothers, the rich went hungry, and tombs were plundered. The central government in Memphis collapsed, and power fractured between rival dynasties in Heracleopolis in the north and Thebes in the south. The First Intermediate Period was a trauma that left a permanent scar on the Egyptian psyche, but it also democratized their view of the afterlife. Previously, the elaborate mortuary texts were reserved for the king. During this chaotic time, the nobility and eventually common people began to adopt these rituals, believing that they too could achieve eternal life if they lived according to Ma'at. This shift is evident in the coffin texts, which evolved from the earlier pyramid texts. The period of division ended when Mentuhotep II of Thebes defeated his northern rivals around 2055 before the Common Era, reuniting the two lands and founding the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is often described by Egyptologists as the period of classical culture. The pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, such as Senusret III and Amenemhat III, ruled with a different tone than their Old Kingdom predecessors. In statuary, Middle Kingdom kings are often depicted not as distant, ageless gods, but as weary rulers with heavy eyelids and lined faces, bearing the burden of kingship. Literature flourished, producing masterpieces like The Tale of Sinuhe and The Eloquent Peasant, which explored themes of national identity, justice, and homesickness. The capital was moved to Ichtawi in the Fayum region, where massive irrigation projects were undertaken to expand agricultural land. The Middle Kingdom also saw significant military expansion into Nubia to the south, driven by the desire to control the gold mines and trade routes. Massive fortresses were constructed along the second cataract of the Nile to secure the southern border, displaying advanced military architecture with dry moats, glacis, and bastions. Yet, stability was once again disrupted, this time by external forces. During the 13th dynasty, the central authority weakened, allowing distinct waves of Semitic-speaking peoples from the Levant to settle in the eastern Nile delta. Over time, these settlers, known as the Hyksos, a Greek corruption of the Egyptian phrase Heka Chasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands, seized power. This marked the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period. The Hyksos ruled northern Egypt from their capital at Avaris, while native Egyptian rulers were restricted to Thebes in the south. While later Egyptian propaganda would characterize the Hyksos as barbaric oppressors, archaeological evidence suggests a period of cultural fusion. Crucially, the Hyksos introduced advanced military technology that the Egyptians lacked, including the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and improved bronze working. These technologies would eventually be turned against them. The expulsion of the Hyksos was a long and bloody process initiated by the Theban kings of the 17th dynasty. King Tao II died in battle, as evidenced by the severe axe wounds found on his mummy. His son Kamose continued the war, but it was his brother Ahmose I who finally captured Avaris, chased the Hyksos into the Levant, and reunited Egypt around 1550 before the Common Era. This victory inaugurated the New Kingdom, the golden age of the Egyptian Empire. Having learned the hard lesson that isolationism was no longer a defense, the New Kingdom pharaohs adopted an aggressive foreign policy. They decided that the best defense was a good offense, pushing Egypt's borders deep into the Levant to the northeast and Nubia to the south, creating a buffer zone to protect the Nile Valley. The 18th dynasty produced some of the most famous figures in human history. Among them was Hatshepsut, a woman who initially served as regent for her stepson Thutmose III, but eventually declared herself pharaoh. She adopted the full regalia of a king, including the false beard, and ruled for 2 decades of peace and prosperity. Her reign is noted for the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, and a famous trade expedition to the land of Punt, likely located in modern-day Eritrea or Somalia, which brought back exotic goods like myrrh trees, frankincense, and leopard skins. Upon her death, Thutmose III took the throne and embarked on a series of military campaigns that earned him the title of the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. He fought 17 campaigns in 20 years, defeating a coalition of Canaanite and Syrian princes at the Battle of Megiddo, and extending Egyptian control as far as the Euphrates River. The wealth that poured into Egypt during the New Kingdom was staggering. Tribute from vassal states and gold from Nubia funded a construction boom, particularly in Thebes, which became the religious capital. The priesthood of Amun-Ra, the composite deity who combined the local Theban god Amun with the sun god Ra, became incredibly powerful. The Temple of Karnak grew into the largest religious complex in the ancient world, a sprawling city of gods receiving vast tracts of land and thousands of servants. This rising power of the priesthood eventually set the stage for a dramatic clash with the crown. Amenhotep III, ruling at the height of the empire's luxury, began to emphasize the worship of the solar disk, the Aten. His son, Amenhotep IV, took this tendency to the extreme, initiating the Amarna Revolution. Changing his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, he declared that the Aten was the sole god worthy of worship, effectively banning the traditional pantheon and closing the temples of Amun. He moved the capital to a virgin site in the desert called Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna. This period also saw a radical shift in artistic style. The rigid, idealized figures of the past were replaced by fluid, sometimes exaggerated portrayals of the royal family, showing them with elongated skulls and potbellies. Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti, played a prominent role in this new religious order. However, the monotheistic experiment destabilized the economy and foreign relations. Upon Akhenaten's death, the old order was rapidly restored. His son, Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun to honor the old god Amun, returned the capital to Memphis, and reopened the temples. While Tutankhamun died young and was a minor historical figure, the discovery of his nearly intact tomb by Howard Carter in 1922 made him the face of ancient Egypt in the modern imagination. Following the turmoil of the Amarna period, a military general named Horemheb stabilized the country, paving the way for the 19th dynasty and the Ramesside period. The most celebrated ruler of this era was Ramesses II, known as Ramesses the Great. Ruling for 66 years, he fathered over 100 children and plastered his name and image on monuments across Egypt. He was a prolific builder, responsible for the Ramesseum and the rock-cut temples of Abu Simbel, which were oriented so that the sun would illuminate the inner sanctum twice a year. Ramesses II is also famous for the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittite Empire in modern-day Syria around 1274 before the Common Era. It was the largest chariot battle in history, involving thousands of vehicles. Although Ramesses claimed a total victory in his propaganda, historical analysis suggests the battle was a stalemate. Crucially, it led to the signing of the world's first recorded peace treaty, a copy of which is displayed at the United Nations headquarters today. As the new kingdom progressed, external pressures began to mount again. The Late Bronze Age was a time of interconnected civilizations, and around 1200 before the Common Era, a systemic collapse occurred across the Mediterranean. A mysterious group of confederated marauders known as the Sea Peoples ravaged the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean civilization. They arrived on the shores of Egypt during the reign of Ramesses III. In a series of land and sea battles, Ramesses III managed to defeat them, preserving Egypt's independence. But the cost was high. The empire was financially drained, and the flow of trade was disrupted. This marked the beginning of a long, slow decline. Internal corruption, tomb robbing, and the rising power of the high priests of Amun in Thebes weakened the monarchy. Eventually, Egypt fractured again, entering the Third Intermediate Period. During the Third Intermediate Period and the subsequent Late Period, Egypt was often ruled by foreign powers or divided among rival dynasties. The Libyans of the Western Desert established dynasties in the Delta. Later, the Nubian kings of Kush, who had been thoroughly Egyptianized during the New Kingdom occupation, invaded from the south. These black pharaohs of the 25th dynasty, such as Paye and Taharqa, viewed themselves as the restorers of traditional Egyptian culture, building pyramids in their homeland of Sudan and renovating temples in Thebes. However, they were eventually driven out by the Assyrians, whose iron weapons proved superior to Egyptian bronze. The Assyrians sacked Thebes, a psychological blow to the Egyptians who considered the city inviolable. Following the Assyrians, a brief renaissance occurred under the native Sayyid dynasty, but it was cut short by the invasion of the Persian Empire in 525 before the Common Era. Egypt became a satrapy of Persia, and the pharaoh was reduced to a client ruler. The final chapter of independent ancient Egyptian history began with the arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 before the Common Era. Alexander was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, and was crowned pharaoh after visiting the oracle of Amun at Siwa Oasis, where he was declared the son of the god. He founded the city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast, which would become a beacon of Hellenistic culture and learning. Upon Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, who established the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were Greek, and for most of their dynasty, they remained culturally isolated in Alexandria, rarely bothering to learn the Egyptian language. However, they respected the native religion and acted as traditional pharaohs to maintain the loyalty of the population. They built magnificent temples at Edfu, Philae, and Dendera, which remain some of the best preserved temples today. This dynasty ended with the famous Cleopatra VII. Unlike her ancestors, she learned Egyptian and was a shrewd politician who tried to navigate the treacherous waters of Roman civil wars. She allied herself first with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, hoping to preserve Egypt's independence. However, their defeat by Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, at the Battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era sealed Egypt's fate. Cleopatra committed suicide, and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, serving as the breadbasket for Rome. The pharaonic tradition slowly faded. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis at Philae. As Christianity and later Islam spread across the region, the ancient gods were forgotten, and the ability to read the sacred texts was lost for over a millennium, until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone allowed Jean-François Champollion to decipher the script in 1822. To fully grasp the magnitude of this civilization, one must look beyond the political timeline and examine the culture that sustained it for 3 millennia. The worldview of the ancient Egyptians was deeply rooted in their geography and their observation of natural cycles. The sun rose and set, the moon waxed and waned, and the Nile flooded and receded. This cyclical nature of life gave rise to a belief in rebirth. Death was not the end, but a transition. This belief drove the massive industry of funerary preparations. The Egyptians believed that a human being was made up of several parts, including the physical body, the Ka, life force, the Ba, personality, and the name. For the afterlife to be achieved, the body had to be preserved so the Ba and Ka could reunite with it. This necessity led to the development of mummification, a process that evolved from natural desiccation in hot sand to a complex 70-day ritual involving the removal of internal organs, dehydration with natron salt, and wrapping in linen bandages. The afterlife was not guaranteed, however. It was a meritocracy based on moral conduct. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and guides placed in the tomb, describes the weighing of the heart ceremony. In the Hall of Ma'at, the deceased's heart was weighed against the feather of truth. If the heart was heavy with sin, it was devoured by a mit, a grotesque hybrid monster, and the soul ceased to exist, a fate worse than hell. If it balanced, the deceased was welcomed by Osiris into the field of reeds, an idealized version of Egypt where crops grew tall and labor was easy. This emphasis on ethical behavior as a prerequisite for eternal life was a distinct feature of Egyptian religion. Medicine and science in ancient Egypt were also highly advanced for their time. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and the Ebers Papyrus show that Egyptian doctors had a pragmatic understanding of anatomy, largely derived from the mummification process. They could set broken bones, stitch wounds, and identified the heart as the center of the blood supply, although they mistakenly thought it was also the seat of intelligence. They used a vast pharmacopoeia of herbs and minerals, some of which, like honey and willow bark, are known to have antiseptic and pain-relieving properties. In mathematics, they used a decimal system and had a strong grasp of geometry, essential for surveying land after the annual floods erased property markers. Their engineering skills, evident in the movement of massive obelisks and stone blocks, relied on simple machines like the lever, the ramp, and the roller, combined with an unlimited supply of organized labor. Socially, ancient Egypt was stratified but not entirely rigid. At the top was the pharaoh, followed by the vizier, high priests, and the nobility. Below them was a crucial class of scribes. Literacy was the key to social mobility. A famous text known as the Satire of the Trades advises young students to become scribes, because every other profession involves misery and hard labor. Scribes ran the bureaucracy, tax collection, and legal system. Below the scribes were the artisans and craftsmen, who lived in relative comfort, and at the bottom was the vast peasantry who worked the land. Slavery existed, but it was mostly composed of prisoners of war, and was not the foundation of the economy in the same way it was in Rome or Greece. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed more rights than in almost any other ancient civilization. They could own and inherit property, initiate divorce, serve as witnesses in court, and run businesses. While they were excluded from the bureaucracy, they held significant power within the household and religion, serving as priestesses. The pantheon of Egyptian gods was vast and fluid. Local gods often rose to national prominence when their city became the capital. The creator god Atum, the sun god Ra, the earth god Geb, and the sky goddess Nut formed the basis of the creation myths. The story of Osiris and Isis was central to the understanding of kingship and death. Osiris, the first king, was murdered by his jealous brother Set, who scattered his body parts. Isis, his wife and sister, reassembled him, allowing him to conceive a son, Horus, before he descended to rule the underworld. Horus then avenged his father and reclaimed the throne. Every living pharaoh was identified with Horus, and every dead pharaoh with Osiris. This myth cemented the line of succession and the duality of life and death. Animals were also viewed as manifestations of the divine. The bull, the hawk, the crocodile, the cat, and the ibis were all sacred, leading to the practice of animal mummification in the late period, where millions of animals were bred, sacrificed, and buried as votive offerings. The architectural legacy of Egypt is not limited to the pyramids. The temple design, which evolved over millennia, was intended to be a model of the cosmos. As one moved from the pylon entrance deeper into the temple, the floor level rose and the ceiling dropped, creating a darker, more intimate space, symbolizing the mound of creation rising from the chaotic waters of the abyss. The columns were carved to resemble lotus and papyrus plants, creating a stone forest. These temples were not places of public worship, but the private residences of the gods, accessible only to the purified priesthood. The common people could only approach the outer gates to leave offerings or await the appearance of the god statue during festival processions. Writing was the backbone of the civilization. Hieroglyphs, the sacred carvings, were used for monumental inscriptions on stone. They were not merely decorative, but were believed to have magical potency. Writing a name made it eternal, while chipping it out destroyed the person's memory. For everyday use, scribes used hieratic, a cursive script written on papyrus with reed brushes and ink. Later, in the late period, an even more simplified script called demotic evolved. The survival of thousands of papyri has given us insight not just into the grand events of history, but into the mundane details of life. Lawsuits over inheritance, laundry lists, love poems, and diplomatic correspondence. The Amarna letters, clay tablets written in cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the day, found at Akhenaten's capital, reveal the geopolitical chess game played between Egypt and the other great powers of the Bronze Age, such as the Hittites, Mitanni, and Babylonians. The decline of ancient Egypt was not a sudden cataclysm, but a slow erosion. The economic strain of maintaining the priesthoods, the loss of military edge as iron replaced bronze, and the ceaseless waves of foreign invaders chipped away at the traditional structure. By the time of the Romans, the distinct Egyptian identity was merging with the broader Mediterranean culture. Yet the allure of Egypt never faded. The Romans were fascinated by the ancient wisdom of the pharaohs, transporting obelisks across the sea to adorn their own cities. The Hermetic tradition, Gnosticism, and alchemy all have roots in the mystical traditions of late Egyptian thought. When we look back at the 3,000 years of pharaonic history, we see a civilization that valued stability above all else. They created a culture that resisted change, viewing innovation with suspicion unless it could be anchored in tradition. This conservatism allowed them to endure for millennia, maintaining a recognizable artistic and cultural style from the age of the pyramids to the age of Cleopatra. They mastered their environment, turning the harsh desert and the unpredictable river into the foundation of the first nation-state. They grappled with the universal human concerns of death, justice, and the meaning of life, creating theological and artistic responses that still resonate today. In the end, the ancient Egyptians achieved their ultimate goal, immortality. They believed that to speak the name of the dead is to make them live again. Today, millions of people who travel to gaze at the Sphinx, who read the history of Ramesses, or who marvel at the golden mask of Tutankhamun are participating in that ancient magic. The temples may be ruins, the religion extinct, and the language spoken only in Coptic liturgies, but the civilization of the Nile remains alive in the collective memory of humanity, a testament to the enduring power of human creativity and the desire to leave a mark that outlasts the sands of time. To delve deeper into specific aspects, we must reconsider the technological mastery required to sustain this civilization. Hydraulic engineering was the unsung hero of Egypt. The shaduf, a counterweight lever mechanism used to lift water from the river to the canals, allowed for the cultivation of land that was slightly higher than the floodplain. This simple device, introduced in the New Kingdom, revolutionized agriculture, allowing for 2 crops a year in some areas. The nilometer, a structure used to measure the clarity and height of the annual flood, was a crucial tool for taxation. If the water reached a certain mark, the scribes knew the harvest would be bountiful, and taxes were adjusted accordingly. This intimate connection between measurement, nature, and state revenue highlights the sophisticated empiricism of the Egyptian administration. Furthermore, the domestic life of the Egyptians provides a humanizing counter-narrative to the grand monuments. Excavations at Deir el-Medina, the village of the workmen who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, have yielded thousands of ostraca, flakes of limestone used as scratch pads. These informal notes reveal a community rife with gossip, strikes, bartering, and romance. We read about workmen calling in sick with excuses ranging from brewing beer to suffering from a scorpion sting or quarreling with my wife. We see records of goods being traded, donkeys, beds, sandals, giving us a relative price index of the ancient economy. We learn about Kenher-Khepeshef, a scribe with a passion for history who collected old papyri, and Paneb, a foreman accused of bribery and sexual misconduct. These are not the remote figures of royal statuary, but recognizable human beings living complex lives. The role of magic, or Heka, in daily life cannot be overstated. It was not seen as supernatural, but as a natural force used to influence the gods and the world. Mothers wore amulets of the dwarf god Bes to protect their children and themselves during childbirth. Ivory wands were used to draw protective circles around sleeping areas to ward off snakes and scorpions. Dream interpretation was a specialized skill, with temples serving as incubation centers, where people would sleep in hopes of receiving divine guidance. This permeation of the divine into the mundane meant that for an ancient Egyptian, there was no distinction between the secular and the religious. Every act, from sowing seeds to building a house, was imbued with ritual significance. The artistic conventions of Egypt, often criticized by early modern art historians as static or primitive, were in fact a highly sophisticated system of communication. The Egyptians did not aim for photorealism, they aimed for completeness. This is why in two-dimensional art the face is shown in profile, the eye from the front, the shoulders from the front, and the legs in profile. This aspective view ensured that all the essential parts of the figure were visible and preserved for eternity. If an arm were hidden behind a body in a realistic perspective, the person might enter the afterlife missing an arm. Art was functional, a machine for the afterlife, rather than merely decorative. The scale of figures indicated their social importance, not their physical proximity, a concept known as hierarchic scale. The legacy of Egypt also extends into the realm of philosophy and theology. The concept of the Trinity, the resurrection of the dead, and the Last Judgment have parallels in the cult of Osiris. The monastic tradition of Christianity began in the Egyptian desert with the Desert Fathers, who repurposed ancient tombs as cells. The word chemistry itself is derived from Kemet, the ancient name for Egypt, reflecting the land's reputation for metallurgical and pharmaceutical knowledge. As we conclude this exploration, it is worth reflecting on the sheer duration of this civilization. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than she did to the construction of the Great Pyramid. The Old Kingdom collapsed and was forgotten by the time Ramesses II sat on the throne. His scribes had to conduct archaeological research to restore the old monuments. This depth of time is difficult to comprehend. Dynasties rose and fell, capitals moved, gods changed names, but the essential character of Egypt, the reliance on the Nile, the divine kingship, and the hope for the afterlife persisted. It was a civilization that looked at the cosmos and saw order, and for 3,000 years it worked tirelessly to maintain that order against the forces of entropy. To penetrate the veil of the past and truly understand the ancient Egyptians, we must move beyond the grand narrative of kings and conquests and descend into the granular details of their existence, exploring the scientific realities of their medical practices, the intricate legal dramas of their villagers, the complex chemistry of their mortuary rituals, and the psychological landscape of their literature. One of the most fascinating intersections of physical reality and religious belief is found in the biological archives of the mummies themselves. Modern paleopathology, the study of ancient diseases, has revolutionized our understanding of the Egyptian population. By subjecting mummies to CT scans, DNA analysis, and chemical testing, scientists have reconstructed a health profile that contradicts the idealized images on the tomb walls. While the art depicts slim, youthful, and athletic figures, the physical remains tell a story of a population plagued by parasitic infections, dental agony, and dietary deficiencies. The Nile, the source of life, was also a vector for schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease caused by flatworms released by freshwater snails. Evidence of calcified schistosome eggs has been found in the kidneys and livers of mummies from all social classes, indicating that everyone, from the peasant waiting in the irrigation canals to the pharaoh hunting hippopotamus in the marshlands, was vulnerable to this debilitating condition, which caused anemia, fatigue, and organ failure. The teeth of the ancient Egyptians reveal another dimension of their daily suffering. Their diet was heavily reliant on bread, but the flour was ground using sandstone querns. This process introduced significant amounts of sand and grit into the dough. Over a lifetime of chewing this abrasive staple, the enamel of the teeth was worn down, often exposing the sensitive pulp and nerves. This led to abscesses, cysts, and severe periodontal disease in several royal mummies, including that of Amenhotep III. The dental decay is so advanced that it likely caused the sepsis that killed them. Interestingly, while the Egyptians were masters of many medical fields, they had no specialized dentistry to treat this. They had recipes for mouthwashes to combat gum inflammation and spells to ward off the worm they believed caused toothaches. But the physical evidence shows little sign of surgical intervention, like drilling or filling. The pain of a toothache was a constant companion in the Nile Valley. Furthermore, the analysis of royal mummies has dispelled the myth of the robust warrior king in many instances. The body of Ramesses V shows clear lesions indicative of smallpox, marking one of the earliest known cases of the virus in human history. Tuberculosis was also rampant, appearing in the spinal deformities of several high-status individuals, proving that the dry desert air was not enough to cure the bacterial infections that thrived in the densely populated mud-brick cities. Moving from the pathology of the living to the preservation of the dead, the science of mummification is a testament to the Egyptians' empirical understanding of chemistry and anatomy, even if their theoretical framework was theological. The central element of the process, natron, was a naturally occurring compound found in dry lake beds, like the Wadi Natron. It is a mixture of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, which acts as a powerful desiccant and defatting agent. It did not merely dry the body, it chemically altered the tissues, creating an environment hostile to bacteria. The process was not static over 3,000 years. It was a developing technology. In the Old Kingdom, the preservation was often external, creating a plaster-like shell over a decaying body. By the New Kingdom, the embalmers had perfected the removal of the internal organs. The extraction of the brain, famously described by Herodotus as being done through the nose, was a delicate operation requiring a profound knowledge of cranial anatomy. The embalmer used a metal hook to break the ethmoid bone, the thin plate separating the nasal cavity from the brain case. They then pulverized the brain matter and flushed it out. Interestingly, they did not believe the brain had any function in the afterlife. The heart was the seat of the intellect and emotion. Therefore, the heart was usually left in place, or, if accidentally removed, sewn back in. The sophistication of the embalmers is further highlighted by their use of resins and bitumens. Recent gas chromatography mass spectrometry analyses of the black goo often found coating mummies and coffins have revealed it to be a complex pharmaceutical cocktail. It included plant resins like mastic and pine, beeswax and bitumen from the Dead Sea. These substances had antibacterial and insecticidal properties. The Egyptians were effectively sealing the body in a sterile, airtight envelope. There was also a tiered system of mummification, a commercial aspect often overlooked. The deluxe package included the removal of organs, 70 days of natron treatment, and elaborate wrapping with high-quality linen and amulets. The economy option, as described by classical texts and verified by archaeology, involved injecting cedar oil or turpentine into the anus to liquefy the internal organs, which were then drained, skipping the surgical incision and the canopic jars. This commodification of eternal life meant that the preservation of the self was a transaction, governed by contracts and market prices, bringing the sublime hope of resurrection down to the mundane reality of what one could afford. To understand the legal and social reality of the common people who could rarely afford such luxury, we must look to the village of Deir el-Medina. This settlement, home to the artisans who dug and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, offers the highest resolution view of daily life in the ancient world due to the thousands of written records left behind. These documents dispel the notion of a totalitarian state where the pharaoh's word was the only law. Instead, we see a litigious society where citizens frequently sued one another over property, inheritance, and personal insults. There was a local court, the Kenbet, composed of village elders and foremen, which adjudicated disputes. However, the Egyptians also relied on a juridical process involving divine oracles. During festivals, the statue of the deified king Amenhotep I would be carried on a palanquin. Villagers would write their questions or disputes on flakes of limestone and place them in the path of the god. The priests carrying the heavy palanquin would stumble forward to indicate yes or backward for no, or move toward a specific text to choose a suspect. While this seems superstitious to the modern mind, it functioned as a binding arbitration system that maintained social cohesion. The records of Deir el-Medina also provide a stunningly detailed account of the first recorded labor strike in history, occurring around 1152 BCE during the reign of Ramesses III. The administrative system had failed. The monthly rations of grain, which served as the wages for the workmen, were weeks late. The scribe Amenok recorded the event. The artisans laid down their tools and marched out of the necropolis, chanting, "We are hungry." They held sit-ins at the mortuary temples of Thutmose III and Ramesses II, refusing to move until their grain was delivered. The local officials, terrified of the disruption to the royal work, tried to appease them with pastries, but the workers demanded their substantial pay. They told the vizier, "We have come here because of hunger and thirst. There is no clothing, no ointment, no fish, no vegetables. Send to Pharaoh, our good lord, about it." This event is crucial because it demonstrates that the Egyptian commoner had a sense of rights and a collective political agency. They were not mindless slaves, but specialized laborers who knew their worth and were willing to challenge the state when the reciprocal agreement of Ma'at, the king provides, the people serve, was broken. In this same village, we find evidence of the darker side of human nature, most notably in the career of a foreman named Peneb. Peneb was the ancient equivalent of a mob boss. A surviving indictment written by his rival, Amenhotep, accuses Peneb of a litany of crimes that reads like a modern thriller: bribery, theft of stone from the royal tomb to decorate his own, sexual assault against local women, and even chasing his own father with a knife. He allegedly bribed the vizier to keep his position. This micro-history of corruption reveals that the lofty moral ideals of the Book of the Dead were often ignored in the grit of reality. Yet the fact that a legal complaint exists suggests that even a powerful man like Peneb could eventually be held accountable by the bureaucratic machinery of the state. The legal system was tested to its limit in the aftermath of the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III. This was not a village dispute but high treason. A minor queen named Tiye wanted her son Pentower to inherit the throne instead of the chosen heir, the future Ramesses IV. She conspired with high-ranking officials, including the royal chamberlain and the chief of the pantry. The plot involved not just assassination, but black magic. The judicial papyri record that the conspirators made wax dolls of the king and his guards, inscribed with incantations to render the targets weak or senseless. This confirms that magic, Heka, was considered a weapon as real and dangerous as a dagger. The plot succeeded in killing the king. Recent CT scans of Ramesses III's mummy reveal a deep knife wound to the throat that was hidden by bandages for centuries, but the coup failed. Ramesses IV ascended the throne and initiated a massive tribunal. The records show the trial was procedural but severe. The conspirators were not all executed publicly. The high-status individuals, including Prince Pentower, were allowed to take their own lives, likely by poison. The mummy of an unknown man found in a cache known as Screaming Man E is believed to be Pentower. His face is frozen in a rictus of agony, and he was buried in a ritually impure goatskin, denying him a proper afterlife, a punishment far worse than death in the Egyptian worldview. Transitioning from the legal to the military, the New Kingdom's expansion was driven by a technological revolution, the chariot. The Egyptian chariot was a marvel of engineering, distinct from the heavier Hittite version. It was built for speed and agility, made of flexible woods like elm and ash that were heat-bent into shape. It carried a driver and an archer. The axle was moved to the rear of the carriage to increase stability during sharp turns. This vehicle allowed the Egyptians to project power rapidly across the deserts of the Levant. But the chariot was only the delivery system. The weapon was the composite bow. Made of laminated wood, horn, and sinew, it had a range and penetrating power far superior to the self-bows of their enemies. The combination of the mobile platform and the long-range artillery allowed the Egyptian army to circle slower infantry formations and decimate them from a distance. The logistics of these campaigns were equally impressive. For the Battle of Megiddo under Thutmose III, the army had to march across the Sinai Desert. Supply lines were meticulously calculated. Scribes recorded the amount of bread, beer, and fodder required for thousands of men and horses. They established supply depots along the Ways of Horus, the coastal road. The army itself was organized into divisions named after the gods, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, each with its own standards and command structure. They utilized signaling systems with polished bronze mirrors and trumpets to coordinate maneuvers. The Battle of Kadesh offers a specific insight into their intelligence failures and tactical recovery. Ramesses II was deceived by two captured Bedouin spies, who were actually double agents planted by the Hittites, into believing the Hittite army was far away. In reality, they were hiding behind the city. When the Hittite chariots ambushed the Ra division, panic ensued. The Egyptian recovery was due to the arrival of the Nearin, an elite unit likely composed of Canaanite mercenaries, or a reserve force arriving from the coast, which surprised the Hittites. This highlights that the Egyptian military was not an ethnically monolithic force. It incorporated Nubian archers, Libyan skirmishers, and Sherdan sea warriors, creating a cosmopolitan war machine. This Sherdan mentioned bring us to one of the most enigmatic chapters, the Sea Peoples. The visuals on the walls of Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, provide the most detailed record of this Bronze Age apocalypse. The reliefs depict a confederation of different tribes, the Peliset, Philistines, Checker, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Wishesh, migrating with their families, ox carts, and possessions. This was not a raiding party. It was a population displacement. The naval battle depicted is the first recorded naval battle in history. The Egyptians did not have specialized warships with rams like the later Greeks. Their ships were modified river vessels with a single square sail and banks of rowers. The genius of Ramesses III's strategy was to trap the Sea Peoples in the Nile Delta, where the shallow waters and lack of maneuvering space nullified the invaders. Seamanship. Egyptian archers on the shore rained arrows down on the enemy ships, while grappling hooks were used to capsize them. The text describes the enemy being, quote, capsized and dragged in their places, and their hearts being taken away. While Egypt survived, the geopolitical landscape was shattered. The trade networks of copper and tin that fueled the Bronze Age collapsed, leading to a dark age in the Mediterranean. Yet Egypt's insular geography allowed it to hold on, albeit in a diminished state. Beyond war and death, the Egyptians possessed a profound intellectual tradition, particularly in mathematics and astronomy, which was driven by practical necessity. The orientation of the pyramids is the most famous example, but the daily application of geometry was just as critical. After the annual flood washed away boundary markers, surveyors known as rope stretchers used knotted cords to remeasure fields. They understood the Pythagorean theorem long before Pythagoras, using the 3-4-5 triangle to create perfect right angles. In the Rind mathematical papyrus, we find problems regarding the slope of a pyramid, the sekid, and the calculation of the volume of cylindrical granaries. They calculated the value of pi as approximately 3.16, a remarkably accurate figure for the time. This mathematical precision extended to timekeeping. They were the first to divide the day into 24 hours, 12 for day, 12 for night, although the length of these hours varied with the seasons. They developed the shadow clock and the water clock, clepsydra, to measure time at night. Their civil calendar, consisting of 365 days, was so useful that it formed the basis of the Julian and eventually the Gregorian calendar we use today. This intellectual curiosity extended to the natural world. Queen Hatshepsut's expedition to Punt was not just for trade, it was a botanical mission. The reliefs show the Egyptians carefully uprooting incense trees, with their root balls intact, placing them in baskets for transport. This is the first recorded attempt at transplanting foreign flora. They established a botanical garden at the Temple of Karnak, where Thutmose III carved detailed depictions of the plants and animals he encountered in Syria, including strange birds and flowers unknown in Egypt. This desire to categorize and understand the world is a hallmark of the scientific aspect of their civilization. However, their science was always intertwined with the symbolic. This is nowhere more evident than in the figure of Akhenaten and the Amarna period. The psychological profile of Akhenaten has fascinated historians. Was he a visionary monotheist, a religious fanatic, or a political pragmatist trying to break the power of the Amun priesthood? The art he commissioned offers clues. The statues show him with a long face, full lips, wide hips, and a spindly upper body. Early pathologists suggested he suffered from Marfan syndrome or Froelic's syndrome. However, these diagnoses don't fully fit the evidence, as he had many children and lived to middle age. A more nuanced interpretation is that the art was symbolic. The Aten, sun disk, was genderless, the creator of all. By depicting himself with both masculine and feminine traits, Akhenaten may have been presenting himself as the primordial being, the mother and father of the nation, the sole intermediary between the god and the people. The city of Akhetaten, Amarna itself, is a marvel of rapid urban planning. Built in just a few years, it had distinct neighborhoods, a grid system, and massive open-air temples to allow the sunlight to enter. The Amarna letters found here give voice to the international diplomacy of the time. We read the desperate pleas of Ribhada, the king of Byblos, begging the pharaoh for archers to defend against the encroachment of the Hittites and the Habiru, a group sometimes associated with the early Hebrews. Akhenaten's lack of response has often been interpreted as pacifism or negligence, but it may have been a calculated strategy of letting vassal states exhaust themselves. The letters also reveal the exchange of royal brides and gifts. The king of Babylon complains that the gold sent by Egypt was like dust, i.e., of poor quality, highlighting that even divine kings haggled over currency and quality control. The role of women in ancient Egypt deserves a deeper dive than a general overview. While they had legal rights, their social roles were complex. In the New Kingdom, the title God's Wife of Amun became one of the most powerful political offices in the land. Initially a religious role, it evolved into a position that controlled vast estates and resources in Thebes. By the late period, the god's wife was the virtual ruler of Upper Egypt, often a celibate daughter of the king who adopted a successor, creating a female dynasty within the patriarchy. On the domestic front, we know about contraception and fertility testing. The Kahun Gynecological Papyrus describes a test where a woman urinates on bags of barley and emmer wheat. If the barley sprouted, it was a boy. If the emmer, a girl. If neither, she was not pregnant. Modern experiments in the 1960s showed this test had a 70% accuracy rate because the estrogen in a pregnant woman's urine stimulates plant growth, a stunning example of ancient empirical observation. We must also consider the Egyptians' view of the past and their own history. They were avid archivists. King lists like the one in the Temple of Seti I at Abydos show the pharaoh offering incense to a list of his ancestors. However, these lists were edited. Hatshepsut and the Amarna kings were omitted, literally chiseling them out of history. This concept of damnatio memoriae reinforces the idea that writing was magical. To erase a name was to destroy the soul. Yet some texts grappled with the futility of monuments. The Harper's songs, inscribed in tombs, contain surprisingly existential verses. The gods who were before rest in their pyramids. Their walls are destroyed. Their places are no more, as if they had never been. These texts encourage the living to make holiday and enjoy life because no one takes his goods with him, and no one who goes comes back again. This skepticism existed alongside the devout belief in the afterlife, showing a culture capable of holding contradictory philosophical thoughts simultaneously. The technical mastery of stoneworking remains one of the most debated mysteries of Egypt. How did they cut granite and diorite, stones harder than iron, using copper and bronze tools? The answer lies in patience and abrasives. They used copper saws without teeth, but the cutting edge was sand, quartz, and water. The copper merely guided the sand, which did the actual cutting. For drilling stone vases or sarcophagi, they used tubular drills made of copper, again with sand as the abrasive, creating a core that could be snapped out. The vast, unfinished obelisk in Aswan provides a frozen moment of this process. It shows the trenches where workers pounded the granite with dolerite balls, a backbreaking process of pulverizing the stone millimeter by millimeter. The sheer expenditure of human calories required to shape these monuments is staggering. It speaks to a society where time and labor were the most abundant resources, and where the outcome was valued more than the efficiency of the process. Finally, the literary tradition gives us the inner voice of the Egyptian. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor reads like a precursor to the Odyssey or Sinbad. A sailor is washed up on a magical island, ruled by a giant golden serpent who speaks prophecies. The serpent tells the sailor that he will return home, but that the island will sink into the sea, never to be seen again. This story explores themes of loneliness, the fear of the chaotic ocean, and the comfort of storytelling itself. Another text, The Dispute Between a Man and His Ba, is a dialogue between a suicidal man and his own soul. The man longs for death, describing it as the smell of myrrh, and sitting under a sail on a breezy day. His soul argues that death is a grim finality and urges him to embrace life. This is a profound psychological document, showing that depression and the struggle for meaning are not modern afflictions, but universal human experiences. In the late period, animal cults exploded in popularity. This was not just zoolatry, it was an economic engine. Pilgrims would buy a mummified ibis, hawk, or cat to dedicate to the god. This demand led to industrial-scale farming of sacred animals. Catacombs at Saqqara contained millions of mummified dogs and ibises. X-rays revealed that many of these animals were killed at a young age, some with broken necks, specifically for the pilgrim trade. Some mummies are actually fakes, bundles of feathers and bones wrapped to look like a bird, suggesting that ancient priests were not above scamming the faithful. This industrialization of sanctity marks a shift in religion from the state-sponsored rituals of the king to a more personal, transactional form of piety accessible to the masses. As the civilization waned under Greek and Roman rule, the Egyptian identity transformed. The Coptic language, the final stage of the Egyptian language written in Greek script, preserved the vocabulary of the pharaohs. The monasticism of the Desert Fathers took the isolation of the ancient tombs and turned it into Christian asceticism. The ancient symbol of life, the Ankh, was adapted into the Coptic cross. The image of Isis nursing the infant Horus likely influenced the iconography of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. Thus, the river of Egyptian culture did not dry up. It flowed into the subterranean aquifers of Western civilization. The magic of Egypt lies in these details. It is found in the fingerprint of a potter left on a clay vessel from 3000 BCE, in the graffiti scratched by a bored schoolboy on a temple wall, in the patch on a linen tunic worn by a farmer, and in the medical recipe for a crying baby. These fragments allow us to see them not as mythical beings of gold and stone, but as people who loved, suffered, cheated, prayed, and died, just as we do. Their civilization was a massive attempt to impose order on a chaotic universe, a project that succeeded for longer than any other culture in history. By studying the microscopic details of their lives, we honor their deepest desire to speak their names, to retell their stories, and to ensure that they continue to live in the light of the sun.